The moment you question someone's money without understanding its source, you're really questioning their entire existence. At 9:17 a.m. inside Meridian Trust Bank's flagship branch in downtown Chicago, the words had not yet been spoken aloud, but the atmosphere already carried their weight like a warning no one noticed. The lobby was polished, quiet, and designed to project control, yet control was exactly what was about to fracture. Ava Richardson stepped through the glass entrance without urgency, her movements measured, her presence understated, almost intentionally ordinary. She wore no visible luxury, no signal of status that the staff could easily categorize, and that was precisely why no one approached her with respect. Behind the counter, branch manager David Collins scanned a glowing screen showing a flagged internal transfer request for $20 million, his brow tightening as he called for verification. When his eyes finally landed on Ava, sitting calmly near the consultation area, something in his expression shifted into assumption rather than inquiry. "We're going to need confirmation that this request is legitimate," he said as he approached, his tone controlled but edged with authority. Ava looked up at him without reaction, as if she had already heard this sentence 1,000 times in different rooms, different cities, different versions of the same misunderstanding. Around them, the bank continued its morning rhythm, unaware that it was about to be interrupted from within. Rachel Moore from compliance joined within minutes, tablet in hand, pulling up risk indicators that flickered across the screen like preloaded doubt. "High-value internal movement, no immediate authorization trail," she said quietly, more to justify the escalation than to understand it. David nodded as if the data confirmed what he already believed. Kevin Brooks, a junior analyst seated farther back, hesitated as he reviewed back-end access logs. Something about the profile code associated with the flagged account didn't align with the narrative forming in the room. He leaned forward slightly, whispering to himself, "That can't be right. That profile is already in the governance registry." But his voice was too soft, too uncertain to interrupt momentum. The assumption had already hardened into procedure. David stepped closer to Ava, lowering his voice just enough to sound procedural rather than personal. "We've seen situations like this before," he said. "People attempt internal transfers without proper clearance and assume the system will overlook inconsistencies." Ava's expression remained unchanged, but her silence began to feel heavier, less like absence and more like observation. Rachel initiated a secondary verification scan, unknowingly running protocols that had been designed under Ava's leadership years earlier. The system responded instantly, flagging anomalies not in Ava's profile, but in the branch's authority level. A subtle alert blinked on Kevin's screen, then another, each one tightening the atmosphere without explanation. Ava finally stood, not in protest, but in recognition that the moment had reached its intended threshold. "You're running compliance checks on a transaction you don't understand inside a framework you don't control," she said calmly, her voice steady enough to stop movement without raising volume. David frowned, uncomfortable but still anchored in authority. "Ma'am, if you could just cooperate with the verification process," he began. But Ava raised her hand slightly, not to interrupt him, but to redirect the system's attention. Her phone remained in her hand, unlocked, waiting. In that instant, the quiet hum of the branch shifted, as if the building itself had recognized a hidden variable entering the equation. Kevin's eyes widened as another internal alert surfaced, this time tied directly to governance override permissions that should not have been active unless authorized at the highest corporate level. Ava looked at David directly for the first time. "Before you continue," she said, "you should confirm who authorized this review." The question did not carry anger. It carried structure. And in that structure, something fragile inside the room began to crack. The silence inside Meridian Trust Bank did not break immediately. It shifted. It was no longer the silence of routine business, but the silence of a system recalibrating around an unknown authority. Ava Richardson remained standing, her presence steady, as multiple screens across the branch began updating at once without human instruction. Branch manager David Collins felt the change before he understood it. Noticing that the compliance dashboard he relied on was no longer responding to his inputs with normal confirmations. Instead, a new message appeared across the internal interface: governance verification required at corporate level. Rachel more tightened her grip on her tablet, her confidence beginning to fracture as she attempted to override the alert, only to find her access temporarily restricted. "This is not standard procedure," she said quickly, more to reassure herself than anyone else. Kevin Brooks, still seated near the back terminal, leaned closer to his monitor as additional fields populated on their own. The internal registry was now cross-referencing Ava Richardson's profile with a set of permissions that had not been visible moments earlier. His breath slowed as he read the classification header, Tier 0 Ownership Authorization. He whispered without realizing, "This is above branch-level access." David turned sharply, hearing only fragments of Kevin's statement, his frustration rising. "Stop guessing and focus on the verification," he said, though his voice lacked the certainty it had carried minutes before. Ava's gaze shifted toward Kevin for the first time, acknowledging his attention without rewarding it. "You are correct," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the growing procedural noise. "This is above branch level." That single confirmation changed the emotional weight in the room. Rachel attempted to initiate a secondary escalation, but the system responded first, locking her out of the compliance override function entirely. A notification appeared across all active terminals. Audit protocol initialization authorized by executive governance tier. David took a step back, glancing between Ava and the screen as if trying to reconcile two incompatible realities. "This cannot be initiated without board-level approval," he said, though the words sounded more like a question than a statement. Ava finally moved toward the central desk, not hurried, not aggressive, but deliberate in a way that forced attention to follow her. "Then it is fortunate," she said quietly, "that board-level approval has already been granted." Kevin's hands froze above his keyboard as he saw a time-stamped authorization appear, digitally signed and verified, originating from a governance identity linked directly to corporate ownership structure. Rachel's expression shifted from confusion to concern as she realized her compliance tools were no longer independent systems, but extensions of a larger framework now actively responding without her control. David tried to regain procedural authority, but the branch intercom chimed softly, interrupting him. A corporate message began routing through the internal system, labeling the situation as a live audit escalation event. Ava looked around the room once, taking in the realization forming in each person's face. "You did not trigger an investigation into a client," she said evenly. "You triggered a review of the system itself." The words did not carry threat or anger. They carried finality. And as the internal systems continued to update around her presence, it became clear that what the room had interpreted as a transaction dispute was already evolving into something far larger, something none of them had initiated, but all of them were now inside. The atmosphere inside Meridian Trust Bank had fully shifted from procedural tension to controlled alarm. Every terminal across the branch now displayed the same restrained but unmistakable message: corporate audit in progress, executive governance oversight active. Ava Richardson stood at the center of it all, her presence no longer questioned in silence, but measured against a system that was now reacting to her authority rather than resisting it. Branch manager David Collins felt the ground beneath his assumptions weaken with each passing second as his access to internal controls continued to degrade. He attempted to contact regional support, but the system rerouted his request without acknowledgement, flagging it as redundant under active governance review. Rachel Moore stepped away from her station, her confidence replaced by visible calculation as she realized that every compliance action she initiated was now being recorded and mirrored at corporate level. "This is not how local escalation is supposed to function," she said, her voice lower now, less certain, as if speaking could stabilize what was already unfolding beyond her control. Kevin Brooks remained seated, his eyes fixed on the audit feed streaming across his monitor. The data was no longer just financial verification. It had expanded into operational authority mapping, tracing decision pathways back through every layer of branch management. He noticed something that made him go still. The authorization signature attached to the audit did not just validate Ava Richardson's involvement. It identified her as originating authority for the compliance framework itself. He swallowed hard before speaking, his voice careful, almost disbelieving. "She is not being reviewed by the system," he said quietly. "The system is being reviewed through her." David turned sharply, refusing to accept what he was hearing, but the confirmation was already visible on multiple screens. Internal permissions were being reassigned in real time, not by request, but by hierarchical override embedded deep within the corporate structure. Ava's expression remained steady, her attention shifting briefly to the compliance console, as if confirming a process she had initiated long before this moment. When a system misidentifies authority, she said calmly, it does not require argument. It requires correction. Rachel attempted to interrupt through procedural channels, but her access to escalation protocols had been suspended pending audit verification. Her frustration surfaced briefly before she regained composure, though the control she was used to exercising no longer responded to her input. David took a step forward, trying to reclaim presence through authority of tone alone. You cannot override an active branch without regional confirmation, he said, but even he could hear the instability in his statement. Ava turned toward him fully now, and for the first time, the room felt the weight of direct acknowledgement. Regional confirmation is already embedded, she replied. You are currently operating inside a structure that was designed to self-audit at this level of discrepancy. Kevin's screen updated again, displaying a synchronized feed of transaction logs, access history, and decision overrides, all converging into a single governance report being compiled in real time. The bank was no longer processing a dispute. It was documenting itself. David looked around the branch as if searching for something familiar to anchor to, but every familiar system had already shifted into observation mode. Even the public interface screens had gone quiet, replaced with a simple corporate status line indicating executive review in progress. Ava stepped slightly closer to the central desk, not as a request for attention, but as the natural focal point of the system itself. You did not misjudge a transaction, she said. You misjudged authority structure. The words landed without force, yet they reorganized the room more effectively than any directive could have. Rachel lowered her tablet, realizing there was nothing left to verify in the way she understood verification. Kevin remained still, watching as the final line of the audit summary prepared to finalize, marking the branch not as compliant or non-compliant, but as under full structural evaluation. And in that moment, it became unmistakably clear that what had begun as a question transfer had already expanded far beyond any single approval chain, evolving into a complete institutional reassessment that none of them had the capacity to stop or redirect. The corporate audit status had now fully propagated across Meridian Trust Bank's internal network, transforming what was once a routine branch environment into a live, centralized observation node under executive governance review. Every action, every input, and every attempted override was now being recorded, synchronized, and evaluated in real time beyond the branch's control. Ava Richardson remained composed at the center of this shift, her presence no longer interpreted as that of a client or stakeholder, but as the originating authority the system was now actively responding to. Branch manager David Collins stood near the main desk, his earlier confidence eroded into cautious silence as he observed multiple system layers locking into read-only mode. He attempted once more to regain local control through manual override, but the terminal rejected his credentials without delay, displaying a simple directive stating that operational authority had been elevated beyond branch jurisdiction. Rachel Moore, still holding her tablet, reviewed the expanding audit feed and realized the implications were no longer confined to a single transaction or account verification. Entire procedural chains were now under review, including compliance decisions, escalation history, and manual intervention logs. Her voice lowered as she spoke, not as an assertion but as recognition of consequence. This is not an escalation anymore, she said. This is a full institutional review. Kevin Brooks, who had remained quiet, now saw additional metadata populate across his screen, revealing hierarchical access mapping that extended far beyond anything visible at branch level. He leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening as he traced the structure of authority permissions now unfolding in layers. What he saw confirmed what he had begun to suspect earlier. The governance signature embedded in the audit was not external. It was originating from within the corporate architecture itself, tied directly to foundational system ownership permissions. He spoke carefully, almost as if trying to verify reality through language. "This is not being triggered from outside the bank," he said. "This is originating from the top level of the institution." David turned toward him immediately, rejecting the implication, but the system interface behind them confirmed it silently. Access logs were no longer static. They were being rewritten in chronological order, reconstructing the branch's decision-making process from the moment Ava entered the building. Each flagged action was being categorized not as error or suspicion, but as procedural deviation requiring structural correction. Ava finally moved toward the central compliance interface, her steps measured and unhurried, not as someone reacting to disorder, but as someone observing a system returning to its intended configuration. The room instinctively followed her movement, not because of authority asserted through force, but because of authority recognized through alignment with the system itself. A compliance system only functions correctly when it recognizes its true governance hierarchy, she said calmly, her voice steady enough to cut through the procedural alerts still flashing across multiple screens. Rachel looked at her directly now, uncertainty replacing procedural confidence as she realized that every action taken against Ava had already been absorbed into a higher level of documentation. "Then what happens to us?" Rachel asked quietly, the question no longer procedural but personal. Ava did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned her attention briefly to the audit timeline now displayed across the main terminal, where each decision made by the branch was being mapped against corporate governance standards in real time. David stepped back slightly, finally understanding that the structure he had relied on for authority no longer recognized his position as decisive. "We are not here to assign blame," Ava said at last. "We are here to restore alignment." Kevin exhaled slowly, the weight of comprehension settling in as he realized the branch was no longer operating under independent authority, but within a self-correcting system that had already begun to restructure itself around a higher directive. And as the audit continued to expand beyond the walls of the branch, it became clear that what they had assumed was a dispute had already evolved into a full recalibration of institutional control, one that no individual inside the room had the ability to pause, redirect, or negotiate. The restructuring of Meridian Trust Bank's internal governance system had now reached a stage where human intervention was no longer the primary driver of activity. Every layer of operational control, from branch-level permissions to regional oversight channels, was being continuously revalidated against the executive audit framework that had been triggered minutes earlier. Ava Richardson stood quietly near the central compliance interface, observing the flow of data as it reorganized itself around a single verified authority structure. The room around her had shifted into a state of controlled uncertainty, where every attempt at action produced immediate system feedback rather than independent execution. Branch manager David Collins remained near the edge of the main desk, his posture increasingly rigid as he recognized that his access was not only limited but being actively monitored for historical compliance deviation. Rachel Moore, who had once managed escalation protocols with confidence, now reviewed a continuously updating audit feed that mapped each of her prior decisions into categorized governance assessments. Her voice carried a subdued tension as she spoke, less as a statement and more as a realization forming in real time. "Every compliance action taken in this branch is now being reclassified," she said, "not as individual decisions, but as part of a systemic review." Kevin Brooks continued analyzing the internal data streams, his attention fixed on the structural hierarchy visualization that had expanded beyond standard operational scope. What he saw now confirmed a deeper shift. The system was not simply auditing behavior. It was reconstructing authority lineage across every layer of institutional control. He noticed that Ava Richardson's profile was not merely being referenced. It was serving as the baseline reference point for recalibration of multiple governance nodes. He spoke carefully, as if confirming something that should not be visible at his level. "The system is not reacting to her," he said quietly. "It is aligning itself with her." David turned toward him immediately, but before he could respond, the central interface updated again, displaying a new directive across all active terminals. Corporate governance, synchronization in progress. Branch-level authority suspended pending structural realignment. The words remained on screen long enough for every person in the room to read them without ambiguity. Rachel lowered her tablet slightly, her earlier procedural confidence replaced by the recognition that escalation protocols no longer applied in a system that was actively redefining its own hierarchy. Ava took a step closer to the compliance terminal, her expression unchanged, her tone steady and precise. When a system operates on outdated assumptions of authority, she said, it will always misinterpret legitimacy as deviation. Kevin glanced at her, then back at the screen where authorization pathways were being rewritten in real time. He understood now that the audit was not simply evaluating past actions. It was actively restructuring operational control moving forward. David attempted to speak, but the words did not fully form. The authority he had relied on minutes earlier no longer had a defined endpoint within the current system state. Instead, every procedural request he attempted was redirected toward executive validation queues that no longer recognized branch-level initiation as sufficient. Ava remained still, observing the final stages of system synchronization as the bank's internal framework completed its transition from distributed authority to centralized executive alignment. This is not about correction of a single decision, she said calmly. This is about restoring the correct definition of decision-making authority. The room fell into a quieter state, not because activity had stopped, but because all activity had been absorbed into a higher level of processing. Kevin's screen dimmed slightly as the audit finalized its current phase, marking multiple branch-level actions as under review within a consolidated governance report. Rachel stood motionless, realizing that nothing she had prepared for applied to the structure now unfolding. And as the system completed another cycle of recalibration, it became unmistakably clear that the branch was no longer operating as an independent entity, but as a live subject within a corporate-wide governance realignment that had already moved beyond human resistance or reversal. The final phase of the corporate audit inside Meridian Trust Bank had shifted the entire environment into a stabilized state of executive-controlled oversight. What had begun as a localized compliance inquiry was now fully integrated into a broader institutional correction process, where every action within the branch was continuously evaluated against a centralized governance model. Ava Richardson remained at the center of this transformation, her presence no longer interpreted through the lens of client interaction or transaction verification, but as the reference point for authority validation across the system. Branch manager David Collins stood near the edge of the compliance area, his earlier attempts at procedural control now completely neutralized by system-level overrides that no longer acknowledged branch-initiated commands as valid inputs. Rachel Moore, still holding her device, observed the final consolidation of audit data as it synchronized across corporate channels. Her voice was quieter now, shaped by the realization that the framework she had trusted for years was not independently stable, but dependent on hierarchical alignment that she had never fully seen. This is not a review of errors, she said slowly, almost to herself. This is a reconstruction of authority itself. Kevin Brooks continued analyzing the live system feed, his attention fixed on the cascading updates that were now locking in permanent governance changes. He noticed that every procedural action previously taken by the branch was being reclassified under a unified structural evaluation index, removing any separation between individual decisions and systemic accountability. What struck him most was that Ava Richardson's profile was not simply validated. It was being used as the anchor point for all recalibration processes. He leaned slightly forward, speaking with cautious clarity. The system is not correcting behavior anymore, he said. It is redefining who had the right to define behavior in the first place. David turned toward him, but no immediate response came, as the compliance interface behind them issued a final synchronization message confirming executive-level stabilization complete. The branch was no longer flagged as under review. It was now permanently integrated into a live audit structure governed externally from its original operational authority. Rachel lowered her device completely, accepting that there was no longer any procedural pathway to revert or interrupt the process she was witnessing. Ava stepped closer to the central terminal, her movement calm and deliberate, as the final layers of the audit sequence locked into place. When governance is misaligned with ownership, she said evenly, systems will always attempt to enforce authority in the wrong direction until correction becomes unavoidable. The words carried no emotion, only structural clarity. Kevin watched as the final audit summary rendered across all displays, confirming full executive validation and branch-level authority suspension across all operational domains. David remained silent, his understanding of the institution he had managed dissolving into a framework that no longer recognized his role as functionally authoritative. The environment itself had shifted from operational space to monitored structure, where every presence was now contextualized within a larger corporate system that had already completed its decision. Ava's gaze remained steady on the interface as the final confirmation appeared: governance realignment complete, authority hierarchy restored, audit closure pending executive acknowledgement. And in that moment, it was clear that the branch had not simply undergone a review, but had been fully absorbed into a redefined corporate order where every previous assumption about control, hierarchy, and decision-making had been permanently rewritten. The confirmation of governance realignment inside Meridian Trust Bank had settled into a quiet but irreversible state, where every system indicator now reflected a completed executive-level audit closure. The branch was no longer operating under uncertainty or active evaluation, but under a finalized structural directive that had permanently redefined authority flow across all operational levels. Ava Richardson stood near the central compliance terminal, her presence unchanged, as if the shift in the entire institution had always been aligned with this outcome. Around her, the environment no longer reacted in bursts of confusion or escalation. Instead, it functioned in a stabilized monitoring state, where every input was logged against a unified governance standard that had already been validated at corporate level. Branch manager David Collins remained motionless near the side of the main desk, his earlier attempts at procedural authority now reduced to observation only, as the system no longer recognized branch-initiated commands as independent decision points. Rachel more slowly lowered her device, her expression reflecting a complete understanding that compliance, as she had known it, had been redefined in real time and without local input. Her voice was soft, almost detached from the procedural mindset she had maintained throughout her career. "We were not managing compliance," she said. "We were operating inside a structure that we never fully understood." Kevin Brooks remained focused on the final audit interface, watching as the last layers of data consolidation completed across the system. What he saw now was not simply resolution, but integration. Every decision taken within the branch had been absorbed into a larger governance record that now defined operational standards moving forward. He noticed that Ava Richardson's profile was not just present in the system logs, but embedded as a permanent reference node within the institutional framework itself. He spoke carefully, as if confirming something that required precision to remain stable. "She is not being recorded by the audit anymore," he said. "She is part of the system that defines the audit structure." David looked toward him but said nothing, as the confirmation appeared across every active screen within the branch. Final governance alignment completed. Operational hierarchy stabilized. Executive authority fully recognized and enforced. The message remained visible long enough for every person present to process its meaning without ambiguity. Rachel stepped slightly back from the compliance station, no longer attempting to interpret the system through procedural logic, but instead recognizing that the framework itself had evolved beyond her interpretive control. Ava finally turned away from the terminal, her movement calm and deliberate, as the final stage of stabilization confirmed across the network. "When systems are built on incomplete recognition of authority," she said evenly, "they will always correct themselves when exposed to structural truth." Her words did not introduce new information. They simply aligned what was already happening into clear understanding. Kevin exhaled slowly, watching as the last audit summary locked into permanent storage, marking the branch not as corrected or penalized, but as fully integrated into a restructured governance model. David remained silent, no longer attempting to assert procedural control, as the reality of the institution he had managed was now permanently redefined beyond his operational influence. The environment itself had transitioned into a steady state of oversight, where every action was continuously aligned with a centralized authority structure that had already completed its determination. Ava stood in quiet observation as the system stabilized completely, leaving no unresolved alerts, no pending escalations, and no remaining ambiguity within the governance framework. And in that final stillness, it became unmistakably clear that what had unfolded was not a dispute resolution, but a permanent institutional realignment that had rewritten the definition of authority within Meridian Trust Bank itself. The stabilization of Meridian Trust Bank's governance structure had now transitioned into a final enforcement phase, where the system no longer displayed signs of active recalibration, but instead operated under a locked executive authority framework. Every terminal within the branch reflected the same unified status: governance alignment complete, audit closure executed, operational hierarchy permanently updated. Ava Richardson stood quietly near the central compliance interface, no longer observed as a subject of review, but as the confirmed anchor point of institutional authority validation. The atmosphere in the branch had changed again, not into tension or uncertainty, but into a controlled stillness where every function now responded to a higher, predefined structure. Branch manager David Collins remained in place near the desk, his earlier sense of procedural command now entirely replaced by passive acknowledgement of system state. He no longer attempted to intervene, as the interface no longer accepted any input that contradicted the finalized governance hierarchy. Rachel Moore stood slightly apart from her previous position, her focus no longer on attempting compliance interpretation, but on absorbing the reality that the framework she had enforced was never independent of the structure now revealed. Her voice was subdued when she spoke, carrying the weight of professional realization. "Everything we believed we were controlling was already defined above our level," she said. Kevin Brooks continued observing the final system outputs, which now displayed a full audit trace across the entire branch history. Every decision point, escalation attempt, and compliance action had been reorganized into a unified institutional record, no longer segmented by department or role, but by governance tier validation. He noticed that Ava Richardson's profile was not only integrated into the system, but actively serving as the baseline reference for all structural alignment confirmations. He spoke carefully, as if acknowledging a fact that required precision to remain comprehensible. "The system is not concluding the audit," he said. "The system is confirming the authority it was always meant to follow." David remained silent, his attention fixed on the compliance display where no further alerts were appearing, only final confirmation status indicators. The branch had moved beyond active oversight into permanent structural integration, where every operational function was now continuously aligned with executive governance directives. Rachel lowered her gaze, recognizing that the concept of branch autonomy no longer existed within the system they were operating in. Ava finally stepped away from the terminal, her movement unhurried and deliberate, as the final confirmation sequence stabilized across all connected interfaces. "When authority is misidentified at any level," she said calmly, "the system will always resolve itself by returning to its true source." Her words carried no force of command, yet they aligned perfectly with the state of the system itself. Kevin watched as the final audit markers settled into permanent archival status, confirming that no unresolved discrepancies remained within the branch record. David stood motionless, no longer attempting to reconcile procedural logic with the framework now fully revealed. The environment around them had reached a point of complete operational stillness, where every process was locked into executive-validated structure and no independent branch-level function remained active outside that hierarchy. Ava stood in quiet observation as the system completed its final stabilization cycle, leaving behind a fully integrated governance model that had replaced every previous assumption of control. And in that irreversible stillness, it became clear that the branch had not simply undergone an audit, but had been permanently absorbed into a redefined institutional order where authority was no longer questioned, only recognized and enforced at its correct origin. The final stage of transformation inside Meridian Trust Bank had settled into a quiet permanence, where the system no longer displayed signs of transition, but instead operated under a fully established executive governance framework. Every terminal across the branch now reflected the same unchanging status, indicating that the institutional audit had been completed and the structural realignment had been permanently enforced. There was no longer any sense of escalation, correction, or procedural uncertainty. The system had reached its final state of organizational clarity. Ava Richardson stood near the center of the branch, her presence no longer interpreted through any operational filter, but recognized as the foundational reference point upon which the entire governance structure had been recalibrated. Branch manager David Collins remained still, his earlier identity as an active decision-maker now fully absorbed into the system's finalized hierarchy, where his role existed only as a recorded participant in a completed audit sequence. Rachel Moore no longer attempted to interpret the compliance interface, as every layer of procedural logic had already been redefined. Beyond her operational scope, her voice, when it came, was quiet and reflective. It was never about the transaction, she said. It was about what the system believed authority looked like. Kevin Brooks continued to observe the final archival state of the audit, where every decision, every escalation, and every attempted override had been consolidated into a single permanent governance record. He noticed that Ava Richardson's profile was no longer simply validated within the system, but had become the structural reference point for all future compliance calibration. He spoke softly, as if confirming the final layer of understanding that the system itself had already resolved. The audit did not end, he said. It defined what the system will recognize as authority from this point forward. David did not respond, as there was no procedural framework remaining that required his input or interpretation. The branch itself had transitioned into a fully synchronized governance state, where all operational functions were continuously aligned with executive-level structure without deviation or local autonomy. Rachel stood in silence, acknowledging that what she had once understood as compliance had been fundamentally redefined into something far more absolute, where recognition replaced enforcement and alignment replaced instruction. Ava finally looked across the room, her expression steady and unchanged, as the final confirmation indicators stabilized across every connected system. When authority is misunderstood at the foundation level, she said calmly, the system will always correct itself until recognition is restored. Her words did not trigger any reaction from the system, because the system had already completed its response. Kevin watched as the last remaining status updates transitioned into permanent archival state, confirming full integration of the branch into the corporate governance framework. David remained motionless, no longer resisting or interpreting, as the structure he once managed had fully evolved beyond his capacity to influence. The environment around them no longer resembled a branch under review, but a permanently integrated node within a larger institutional intelligence framework that had already completed its redefinition of control. Ava stood quietly as the system reached its final equilibrium, where no alerts remained, no exceptions existed, and no independent authority persisted outside the confirmed hierarchy. And in that final stillness, it became undeniable that what had occurred was not a correction or a dispute resolution, but a permanent restructuring of institutional reality itself, where authority was no longer questioned, only recognized in its correct and final form.